All right, everybody, welcome to the Hart Hustle podcast. Here we talk about important subjects that have to do with heart and have to do with hustle. And my first guest today is going to be Brian Poindexter. Brian is a community builder. He is the leader of the Beehive on LinkedIn, which is one of the ways which I continue to see you kind of churning up community, making connections with others, but having important conversations. So Brian is an HR consultant. He's been working with some amazing organizations, and he was on my previous podcast where we talked about the importance of people, the importance of connection, and the importance of culture. And today's conversation is really going to be focusing on those things. Brian, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate you.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Absolutely. So let's just get into it. You know, the current state of our economy, 2023 has been very challenging for so many people. And when I hop on the news, when I see the media, I see breaking news, more layoffs are coming. And it's a super challenging time for so many people. Google, 12,000 people. Zoom recently laying off 1,300. 3M, 2,500. Microsoft, 10,000. Crypto.com, 20% of their staff. Amazon, 18,000 here, 12,000 there. Disney, Vimeo, Pinterest, GoDaddy. The list goes on. So Absolutely. From an HR perspective, what is your current analysis of the marketplace? Why are we seeing so many jobs being laid off? And how do you think people are handling this kind of current time in our economy?
No, great question. So the first part of it, and why we're seeing it, there could be a lot of different ways that you can look at that. And one thing I like to kind of dispel immediately is that the first thing that we think is just, oh, it was gross mismanagement when they had these type of layoffs to happen, or, you know, they just didn't care about people and they just were about profit and so on and so forth. But the truth be told, a lot of these companies were trying to do the right thing. They were, you know, they saw an opportunity, they had a boon of success. And they wanted to bring the people in to support it, not knowing what effects a pandemic could have and things like that and what would happen afterward. So it was something that couldn't have been planned for. So, you know, not making excuses for it. But at the end of the day, that is a part of it as well, is that the market has changed. And the other side of it is, at the end of the day, everything has changed as far as how we operate business. And companies are having to try to find different ways to be able to be sustainable. And unfortunately, we're seeing a shift into, well, let me say, away from people being the center of that universe, right? So for so long, it was about how many people can I have and how many specialists can I have and how can I be able to bring all that together to make us work. But now we're seeing some new things to start to show up in our lives, whether it's AI or, you know, ways that they're able to do certain things that they don't necessarily need that workforce. And we all know if we see anything that happens when it comes to a lack of profitability, a loss of funding, so on and so forth, the number one thing we're going to cut and the best controllable is going to be labor, right? But the truth of the matter is, if they can find a way to be able to cut labor, but also be able to find ways to still remain productive, and in some ways even become more productive with a smaller workforce, then they're doing that. So we have to separate the business side of it from how they're handling it, because that's two different things. Right. So how they've handled it and what we've seen, yes, very scary. There's nothing people-centric about most of these layoffs and how they've been handled. But let's not make it seem like that some of these aren't shrewd business moves. It's just that there are real people behind those decisions once you make those.
Absolutely. And, you know, one thing I really kind of think about these days is the impact of technology on our businesses. And we're going to get into the whole AI conversation and how leaders are kind of looking at these tools that are becoming such a huge part of the future for how somebody runs a business and how they impact the culture of an organization. But what I want to kind of go back to really quick is, from an HR perspective, we're talking about being the managers of important assets, and that's people. How are HR leaders kind of handling hardship in organizations when it comes to laying people off? Because, you know, it's very difficult to, from my perspective, it's very much easier to turn off somebody's email. It's a different experience from an HR leader to have to let somebody go. So how do you kind of, from an HR leadership perspective, kind of bona fide yourself to be able to have the personality and be able to deliver tough news to people when it's coming to, you know, we have to lay off staff. We're going to have to kind of figure out how we can be as lean as possible. What does that mindset look like for an HR leader when tough times are coming and you're going to have to let people go?
So a little bit of a loaded question, and here's why I say that. It's really because of whatever equity that you built up before that situation. So those the organizations or companies that have been people centric from the beginning, that have built that type of relationship with people that they've been working with, as opposed to just having people that work for them, then it's a lot easier to be able to have that conversation because I can discuss it with you to where you know and understand that this is not a personal decision. This is not a not caring about your decision. I know and understand who you are and how this may affect you, but this is how this is what we have to do, and we want to be upfront with you and let you know so you can prepare. Right. So that's one school of thought of being able to do it. Unfortunately, most organizations and companies right now have not built that type of equity with their staffs. Right.
Hmm.
So there is no connection when it comes to having believability when you say that this is just business. And then when you do it in a cold hearted fashion to where there's no communication, to where there is no respect of how this may affect you after you walk out of those doors, then that is a totally different mindset and you're treating people as numbers instead of names. Uh, so it really just depends on what's been built up before then. And so, what HR executives specifically have to look at is if we haven't built that equity before then we have to do what it takes as quickly as possible to let people know what's going on and to let them know that we care, right? Because at the end of the day, once you finish your layoffs, there are still people that are going to be there. There are still people that are working for you. There are still people in the future that may be thinking about working for you. So we have to get out in front of that. And one of the big things that goes along with that, to me personally, is helping people to understand the power of transparency. So
Hmm.
if this is happening and we have to do these layoffs, and we also haven't built the type of equity that we should have in you and then as people centric as we should be, we have to own up to all of those facts, right? So some people will find a little bit of comfort in your ability to be transparent when those situations come up, especially when they weren't expected. Right. So you have a quick downturn in your economy, and we have to make moves to be able to keep the doors open as an organization. Then I have to be honest with that and let them know that, hey, I know this is a shock. I know this is crazy. I understand how this may affect you. And I also know that we haven't done our best to be able to give you that feeling of comfort and trust in our company. But this is what's happening. And this is why we have to share it with you now and try that transparency role. And that's the best thing that you can do. If you put your head in the sand and just make it seem like that it's just business that people will understand, then that's not sustainable because you still have people that work for you and you still have people that may want to work for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I think about is when we talk about being a people-centric organization, something that really just rubs me wrong and I get kind of the chills is when I hear mass layoffs being delivered via an email with no heads up. It seems so impersonal and it seems so transactional. So what's your 2 cents when you hear a big story like 18,000 people got laid off? The only reason that they heard was their email didn't work in the morning. Then they received a cold letter from HR that said, "Hey, unfortunately your position's been eliminated. Best of luck basically out there. We'll let you know if your position opens back up." How do you feel about that kind of, rhetoric in business?
So it makes me feel a couple of things: shame, disappointment, frustration. Um, it's really a point to where we have made putting people first as if it were rocket science. We have created this situation to where we think that it is so difficult to make people feel significant and to treat them in a manner that lets them know that they actually have a name. So I get frustrated by it because it's all about intention. So we can be intentional about what we choose to be intentional about. So if we choose to be intentional about treating people like that, then that's a problem that is so much bigger than just the layoffs, right? I mean, we're talking about a societal issue. We're talking about what happened to the point to where a long time ago, the workforce was basically treated like a family. Like we all worked together. We were a part of something that was bigger than ourselves. But as capitalism has grown and as we've gotten to a different part of our society now, it's a lot more of me first. It's a lot more let me protect old number one. And then what happens to people, they're treated as collateral, right? It's collateral damage. That's how people are treated. It's almost like we're in a war as opposed to just in business and working with people. So it's definitely frustrating. Um, and it's definitely something that hurts me from an HR standpoint because I know so many HR executives that are caught in the middle of it that have no choice because they're trying to hold on to their job. They're scared. So they're like, hey, I have to do whatever I can just to keep my job. And then they're forced to be put in these situations to where they have no win in that at all. So just as quickly as people want to point the finger at HR as well, it's like, well, we have to be cognizant that there are situations where they're trying to just hang on and survive themselves, right? So now it's become a situation of survival of the fittest. And that's a scary place to be when it comes to business. But I will say this, the one thing that I do like about all of this that's happening is that there is a window to business that we've never had before. These types of things would have been happening behind closed doors for the most part in the past, but now with technology and all the things that have been put out there, there's a voice that's out there that's different. So now a lot of these companies are being put to the forefront and putting their feet to the fire, and they're having to explain why they're doing what they're doing and face the fire, not only from the people that they let go, but the general public as well. So if anything that's good has come out of it is that there is a little bit more of an eye now on how they are handling their business when it comes to people. And it's a way to be able to hit the reset button.
Yeah, I mean, there's a transparency to culture. You know, one of the best analogies that I love is when you hear about people's glass door, right? Their glass door reviews, how people give transparent and understandings of how the business runs behind the doors, right? That glass door is a great analogy for kind of the transparency that we see today. So my question is, going back a little bit, you know, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't recognize is a lot of these mass layoffs have to do with the economic state of how a business is performing. And it does create more of a transactional relationship between employer and employee. You know, I often hear people say, I don't understand why they had to lay off so many people. Zoom is a great example. Love the organization. I saw them when they were very small. They had a team of like 96 people back when I came across them in 2014. And hearing that they laid off 1,300 people was heartbreaking because I know the culture of that organization. But the one thing that a lot of people don't recognize is when you end up going public, you take VC money. It ends up being about the dollars that are made at the end of the quarter. And so when you guys don't perform to a certain level, then it creates that transactional relationship between employer and employee. And that feeling of family has almost been lost because it's all about the Benjamins at the end of the day. What's your kind of 2 cents on where the status of, you know, current business looks and how it's kind of all about the money, all about the dollar, rather than the people, the family, like you said, that kind of make up the organization?
Well, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. We've become a business society that is caught up in the bird in the hand, right? So I have to hold on to what I have at all costs because we're afraid of taking chances. The thing that makes the biggest impact in business as it evolves and there's change happens are the ones that are bold enough to do something different. Right. So those that have sustained are companies that are built that way. Your Apples, your Nikes, your people like that that really are not afraid to be on the cutting edge, not only with their product, but also with how they handle the people with it. Right. And then, unfortunately, you still see situations like a Zoom, you brought up a great point, that have a pretty good culture and have really done some things right. But an economic turn can cause you to have to make quick decisions to be able to, again, keep your doors open. And it's something that you couldn't have prepared for, right? You know, so if we think back to when the pandemic starts, boom, all of a sudden everybody's out of the offices. We need to be able to communicate. What's the best way? Zoom is here. So now they have a boon of people trying to get onto these conference calls on the cloud. So they have to build up people, right? You have to add staff to be able to handle that influx of business that you have. But what they couldn't have saw was as we come out of the pandemic and people start returning to the office, how much it was going to go back to a little bit of the norm. So we thought and predicted that, hey, this is going to be the beginning of so much more cloud meetings and so many more opportunities to do things hybrid and remote. Yes, they're still there, but it's not as sustainable as people thought. So there's been a lot more of going back to status quo and even companies pushing people to come back to the office, right? So even though Zoom may have wanted to do it that way and keep it that way, business didn't dictate that. So they had to make some moves, right? And so that's why I'm big on being able to separate the situation sometimes from the organization or those that run it, because sometimes business is cruel. Sometimes business hurts. But still, the way that they handled it was better than what you saw with some of those other organizations that didn't even think to treat people as if they were more than just that number on their sheet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what I heard you kind of say there, what popped into my mind was maybe this isn't a correction as much as it is a normalization of the market, right? We saw such boom that it's only normal for us to come down to a certain point where we can now be stable and continue to operate our businesses the best that we possibly can. I want to transition a little bit kind of into the topic of heart. So an organization that lays off a mass number of people, they have to be leaving a certain taste in people's mouth when they hear about the big bad organization who let 1,300 people, 18,000 people go. So how does an organization now start to kind of nurture the culture of their organization to be able to attract the top talent that maybe got let go from another organization? How do they kind of position themselves as still being like, hey, we're a great company to work for. We still deserve the best talent, the best people to come here, but maybe the way that everybody got laid off kind of wasn't handled in the best way. Does that make sense? How does an organization eliminate the bad taste from an or from in the community's mouth and then kind of start nurturing that people first mentality again?
So the first thing I would say would be contrition, right? We have to be able to discuss what happened clearly and openly, uh, and not try to make it seem like that it wasn't what it was. We had to make a hard decision, and we did it in a way that wasn't something that was very palatable for people that didn't know the inside workings of what happened. And then there were some things that we didn't handle properly because we were scared, we were frightened. Think about when you're in a situation where something is threatening something that you love, and you have to do everything that it takes to preserve it. I have to make tough decisions, and sometimes those decisions aren't as people focused as I would like them to be. So we have to start with contrition. We have to talk about this is what happened, this is why it happened, and also we understand that it wasn't the best way to handle it, right? And then to move forward and to be able to build something different, you have to talk about what you're going to do differently, right? How are we going to protect ourselves from this happening again? So instead of pivoting right back into the money or pivoting right back into the bottom line and talking about that, pivot and start talking about we are doing some structural work. We're doing some cultural work, right? We are building our workplace again to make sure that we are insulating ourselves from having to ever have to deal with that again and putting our people who are our greatest resource at risk that way and force us to have to make a bad decision. So when you can start off with contrition, and then also be able to pivot and then show people what you learned from it and what you'll do differently, you can rebuild that, right? There's not too many situations where you don't have an opportunity to be able to recover. It's all about how you handle the adversity and the challenge after it happens. So that's my best way of doing it. And when we go in and deal with, executives or C-suite and talk to them about what can you do to be able to repair, those are some of the biggest things that you can do. And it's hard, right? Because when you are an executive, you're not built that way a lot of times, right? You're forced to have to think of things at 35,000 feet and above, as opposed to thinking of it as if this is happening to somebody right now, in that moment, because you're not boots to the ground. So you have to own that, right? And it's very difficult. It's very difficult, but it can be done. Again, it just has to be intentional.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. Now, so we've talked about the organization. Let's kind of pivot to the employee, the people of the organization. So let's say that I am, someone who contributed 10, 15 years to an organization, right? I get let go because of the current economic state. Maybe new leadership has come in. They let me go. I've got a bad taste in my mouth, right? Now that's going to hinder the way I approach engaging with a new organization. So what type of questions as an employee should I be asking of an organization to kind of start building that trust and kind of make sure that if I'm going to be putting my valuable time into a new organization, they're going to protect me as a person. I just won't end up as another person who kind of gets cast aside because I came from that experience and it didn't feel good. What type of questions do you think I, as an employee, should be asking when I go through the interview process when I'm trying to get myself back out there?
Right. And I'm so glad that you went there, first of all, because that's the first key, right? Is that people have to transition from thinking that the interview only belongs to the company. An interview is a two-way street, and it belongs to both of you. And there are some things that are your responsibility to ask to make sure that you are getting into the best situation, especially when you've seen something happen previously like that with said company, right? So number one, don't be afraid to ask about the elephant in the room. Ask them to, hey, talk to us about what it felt like to have to complete those layoffs and what are you doing differently going forward. I should be able to get an answer for that. right? And if you shy away from that, or if you feel like that it's not important, then it's always already a red flag of like, okay, hmm, I'm not sure that this may be the place for me. And then secondly, ask about things like, what are you doing from a development standpoint? How are people growing their careers when they're working with you? I saw that there are situations where people have been let go. There's a little fear now that I have about, joining a company and being able to grow within it if I'm just going to be pushed to the wayside. So, what do you do to be able to not only, strengthen me to be able to move up within your company, but also what are you giving me to be able to transition if I ever had to leave your company based on something like this happening, right? Development is a big key. If a company can't tell you about some of the tough things that they've dealt with, and if they cannot talk to you about development and culture, then I would say you probably want to start thinking about running for the hills, right? Because that should be a place of pride for you, right? When somebody asks me about Performance Point and what we're about, you're going to be hard pressed for not getting at some point our talk about the culture that we have in our firm, right? And how we handle the people that are there and how we feel like a family and how that comes first before anything that we do, and the standards that we set and values that are not just on the wall, but to come off the wall and are actually in the people, right? If a company shies away from that, what does that tell you, right? Or if there's no answer, what does that tell you? So we have to start asking those tough questions about the elephant in the room, ask about the development and career protection for yourself, and then how is the culture there and what are they doing to sustain it?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I just think that, if you don't ask those types of questions when you're engaging with a new organization, you're going to find yourself kind of getting set up for heartbreak. There was an individual who reached out to me in late 2022 on LinkedIn, and I saw that she was upset on a post. And she said, I just got let go from a large healthcare insurance company. I was there for 20 years. New leadership came in and they let me go. And to be honest, I don't know what I'm going to do in my next phase of life. And so me and her had a conversation kind of in the DMs about like, hey, listen, this is a setback for sure, but that does not diminish you as an individual nor what you contributed to your previous organization. The fact that they let you go might just meant that, hey, we were in a tough economic state. We had to prune back a couple trees and you were just a part of that. Now, since then, she's also found a new organization that she works for. And me and her checked in on each other the other day. And she was like, you know what? I'm just so appreciative for the fact that you reminded me that I wasn't tied to that role. I took a couple days to step back, but then I put myself back out there. And now I feel like I'm in a better situation. And I feel like that's going to be the story for how a lot of people handle this time of hardship or normalization in the ecosystem, right? I think it's just so important to remember that you as a person have so much to contribute. You're not just the role that you performed in the organization you were at before. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to remember that we are more than our task and our title. Right?
Yeah.
And so we have to stay in touch with that. We have to stay in touch with who we are and what we think of ourselves, just as much as we tend to give away all of that to the organization that we work for, right? We basically put our worth in how we are being viewed. And one of the things that's hardest for a lot of people, even as I coach leaders and things like that as well, is helping them to understand that it's okay to be able to say that I do things very well, right? This is something that I specialize in. This is something that I feel like that I have mastered, so on and so forth, right? But if we never get that point to where we can validate ourselves, then we are totally dependent on what others may see of us. And then to your point, when there's a situation that happens when it's just business, we take it as personal because everything is tied to the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm bigger on the impact that I have as opposed to the metrics that I perform with, right? So what impact am I having on people and the organization? That's what lasts, and that's what is the bridge to be able to get you to where you need to go.
Absolutely. One of my favorite leaders from a business perspective is Gary Vee. So Gary Vaynerchuk has a book called 12 and a Half, where he talks about the importance of the soft skills. And as I kind of look at some of the soft skills that he talks about in this book, I want to get your opinion on some of these and why they're so important as a leader. Exactly. Okay. So a couple things that he talks about is self-awareness as a leader, incredibly important. And when we see kind of the transactional nature of business today, I feel like many leaders feel like they are separate from the organization and maybe the actions that they're taking don't impact everybody else's perception of them. So how do you think self-awareness from a leadership perspective in 2023 is important, and why should more people be leaning into that factor of self-awareness?
It's even more so now, in my opinion, because of the different types of workplaces that we have. When there's the introduction of remote or hybrid type of situations, how we present ourselves and how we create connectivity is more important than it ever has been before. And we have to create a trust system that is bigger than just you are coming here to work because of security, or you're coming here to work because I have to put food on the table, so on and so forth. People's values have changed, right? So for so long, that's the only reason that we would stay in a job is because we had to.
Hmm.
Now, for the first time in decades, if not centuries, the employee actually has leverage, and they're actually able to choose the type of environment they're wanting. Right, they're wanting situations. Right, so if people are looking for the best situation and not the best money and all of that as the number one goal, then as a leader, I have to be very aware of my actions and what things come of those actions. So if I do something, or if I make a decision, or if I communicate in a certain type of way, how does that impact the people that are working for me, the people that are my peers, and also those that are employing me, that I'm a direct report to, right? And now you have to have much more of a finger in the pulse, on the pulse of what your actions actually cause. That's why I'm big on that impact. That's what I just talked about a couple of minutes ago. Impact is powerful now, more so than it ever has before. And the question is, what type of impact are you having? If you're not aware of it, then those are the times where you have an inflated view of self, or you
Hmm.
have a total distancing of self. Either one are total disasters when it comes to really being a people-centric type of leader or servant leader.
Absolutely. A couple of the other factors in here, or the elements of those soft skills. One is curiosity. Another is patience, conviction, and the last is humility. Now, I love
Mm,
humility because it speaks to something that you and I have talked about offline, as well as in our previous podcast together, which is many people think about businesses as being B2B businesses or B2C
mhm.
businesses. But at the end of the day,
Correct.
people do business with people. So it's a P2P
Correct.
business. And that's one of my favorite small analogies because it really does talk about the human connection that's necessary. So, what
Mhm.
is an example of a leader who you engaged with that was just top notch when it came to that human connection and communicating humility in kind of their organization? And what was the impact that you kind of took away from, being exposed to somebody who had that just dialed in?
Right. Now, I could give a lot of people. I could talk about a lot of people, but I can talk about what I'm actually dealing with right now. Right. So my CEO at Performance Point is Brad Fetterman, and he is a person that is about people from the beginning to the end. Right. So he and I were introduced to one another by a third party. And this third party, we didn't know that they knew either one of us. But the thing that to her brought us together was, she's like, you know what, Brad has a really strong feeling about people, and you are so passionate about people. I got a feeling that you guys might want to meet. So we go and meet. We have a talk. We talk for hours, and we don't talk about the business. We don't talk about any of that. We talked about people. We literally talked about people for hours. And then he had no idea what he wanted to do with me. I had no idea why I wanted to work with him other than that connection right there. And then we said, you know what, we're going to make this work. However, this will work. We're going to have to make it work because it's hard to find people that feel that way, right? And the thing that he believes in, and why I believe in him, is that he believes that values and morals are something that are living and breathing. They are not something that we just talk about and put out there on a mission statement and then just say that's who we are, but we don't ever live that. So in everything that he does, whether it's the way that he communicates with us every day, whether it's the check-ins that you get that are non-business, whether it's the curiosity that you talked about before of wanting to know about us as people as opposed to what we do for him, right? Those are big differences. So that curiosity that he has about who I am is what actually led us to be able to figure out what my role was going to be, in his consulting firm. Because he was like, well, what do you like to do? What is it that, drives you? I was like, well, I love leadership development. I love coaching. Um, so on and so forth. He was like, yes, yes, yes. He was like, you can do all that, right? So that's how I got my title. He was like, you can consult, you can be a leadership coach, and you'll be able to facilitate and train. Um, but it was all based on his curiosity. Simple as that. He didn't look at my resume. It was about curiosity, right? So, and the other part that I love about him is that what you just brought up was the humility, right? So the one thing that he despises, and we laugh about it all the time, is that he hates if I ever call him his boss, or my boss, or my supervisor. He's like, no, we're colleagues, right? And I'm like, how? We're not colleagues, so this is your business. It has your name on the business. What are you talking about, right? And he was like, no. And we actually had this conversation just yesterday, which is funny. But he was like, no, I really believe that my success is based on what we can do together, right? I need this from you, and then you get this from me, so on and so forth. And then when we collaborate, we can do special things. That's what leadership means when it's true leadership as opposed to just managing. So he is humble. He is curious. He has those soft skills that make you want to work for him. I always ask leaders this. I was like, do people want to work for you, or do they work for you because you want them to?
And the best way to do that is kind of leading from the front, right? One of my favorite little like memes that I've seen on the internet is the difference between a boss and a leader. And now there's a guy who's standing on top of a brick while everybody else is pulling the brick forward, and that is a boss. But a leader is somebody who is in the trenches with the group of people, helping them participate, helping them execute every single day. And going back to Gary Vaynerchuk, he always talks about, if you think as the leader of an organization, other people work for you, you've got it completely backwards because you work for these people. And I think that type of servant leader or servant leadership in itself is just incredibly powerful because they want to know the people who you work with, keyword, that you're in the trenches with them and you're not just separate from the entire, organization making shots and calls from the very top, because that doesn't feel good. And that's not a part of the culture that I think a lot of people want to be a part of these days.
Yeah, it's something again that has to be intentional. You have to really believe that, because I have heard a lot of leaders say that they are willing to work beside their people, so on and so forth. But when the rubber hits the road, or when a challenge hits, or whatever the case may be, it becomes, what did you do? Or what did you not do? Or, you could have done this better. Like, well, that's interesting because you were just talking about how you were in this together, but there's literally no accountability for yourself. Right. So one of the things that shows that ability to be able to work with people is that accountability and self-awareness that we just talked about, right? If I make a mistake as a leader, then I have to own up to it, right? If I don't put you in the best position to succeed, that is on me, right? Just as much as it may be on you in this situation, or it might be even more so me. So that's what people are looking for. They're looking for actual relationships with their, supervisors and leaders, as opposed to just going in and being a number and just doing tasking, and just being someone that is very insignificant. Because if I'm just a tasker, anybody can do my job, right? And then if I have somebody that's not in there with me, I know I'm expendable. But if there's that, if it's more than transactional, and if it becomes investment, right? That's my favorite word when it comes to leadership. Are you investing in people? Because if you're investing in them, they feel that connection. They feel like they're significant to you and to the business. Right. And that's going to drive me to push harder, to work harder, to be the best form of myself that I can be. If I'm only a tasker, or if I'm only a person that's a title, then I'm not going to be able to give you everything that I have. I would never reach my max potential. It just doesn't happen because human nature won't allow it. Whether we like it or not, that's the mental health aspect of it. Right. If we're not mentally healthy, then we will never be at the top of our game. So if mental health is strained, if emotional intelligence is rare, then that's not a workplace that's going to be conducive of high-performing people that want to stay.
That's right.
Bottom line.
I totally agree with that. One of the things that you said there that's very interesting to me is I've gotten a little bit older and become a better leader. I have started to take more accountability for everything that happens in my ecosystem. And Brian, there's extreme power in taking accountability for everything. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be responsible for everything, but being a leader and recognizing that the buck stops with me. So when things don't go well, you don't blame others, but you say, how could I have improved in this situation? How could I have been a better communicator? How could I be a better leader to help us execute on all these initiatives? Is something that I take incredible pride in. Give you an example. Sometimes we have things when we go do an implementation. We have a hospital system right now that my team's standing up, and we've got a large patient observation program that's going out there, right? And so one of the things that we've had trouble with is getting the nurses up and going with the actual system. And so when we do our rounds for training, the organization kind of comes back and we hear, oh, we didn't know that this program was live. We didn't know that we were supposed to be doing these things. And as a team, we meet and we start trying to naturally point fingers and say, we've done everything that we should have done. but you guys, the organization of this hospital, should have done these things better. And so it is incredibly powerful for me to slow the team down and say, hey, if this is the thing that we're seeing, how could we have done better in this situation? So the next time this comes up, we're not going to have to deal with the issues, the I didn't knows. So how can we look inward first to take that sense of accountability, to take the power away from our failures and own them and say, we're in control of this situation. I just love being able to take accountability in all of those situations. It's huge for me.
No, that's huge, and I love that, because that's a great example of something that I'm personally passionate about, is that there are two things that I want to remove the negative stigmas from. Number one is mental health. Number two is accountability. Right? Because when we hear mental health, we think of mental illness, which are not the same thing, right? And then also when we hear accountability, we think of performance management, pointing the finger, what did you do wrong, right? Accountability is not about that. Accountability is the opportunity for learning. It's an actual stepping stone to the next level if we decide, that, okay, I want to receive what I did well, I want to receive what I didn't do well. And then to me, it's basically data more so than anything else. It's just data, right? So if I'm not doing this well and the data supports that, then I have to own that and say, you know what, I can do this differently. So the accountability doesn't always reflect negatively on who you are as a person or even your intent. Sometimes it's literally just data that we need to use to be able to move forward and get better. That's what training and development is about. That's what all of that is about, is just learning from the things that we may have erred on or mistakes that we may have made. That's human nature as well, right? Everything that we have gained from a society in evolution has come from the mistakes that we made and the errors that we made and things that we learned from it. The question is, how do you deal with that? Do you own that and let people know that I see it and I know that I have flaws just like you do? Then that is something that makes leaders palatable, is because you are humanized, right? Unfortunately, so many of our leaders think that they have to be robots. They think they're supposed to be perfect. They think that I'm supposed to have all of the answers. And then if I have any chinks in my armor, then people won't believe in me. That is personal pressure that you've put on yourself. That is not the pressure that people have put on you that are your direct reports. You have to know the difference, right? So we have to own our humanity ourselves, even before we ask people that are working, with us to do the same. So we have to own that, own those mistakes, own those errors, say, hey, this is a stepping stone for us getting better. I'm going to do this. And in fact, this is what you can do to be able to help me with that, so on and so forth. And what can I do to help you? And once we are doing all of those things and asking those right questions at that point, that's what builds that cohesive unit. That's what builds that culture. And that's what makes people want to continue to work with you and not think that I'm just working for you.
Absolutely. I mean, what we're really talking about here is near and dear to my heart, which is kind of a growth mindset. Carol Dweck came from the University of Stanford, talks about in her book, a growth mindset, and how we are not limiting ourselves based on our idea of perfection, but the progress and the steps that we take in improvement are the entire mission. And I love, hearing about a mindset from a leadership perspective that is based on a growth mindset. It's not the end goal, but is the process that we're in of self-improvement, of recognizing the data, like you talked about, and how we can utilize it to be better next time. And if we can put ourselves in that situation of we are never going to be perfect, but we're always growing, we're always evolving, and kind of putting ourselves in the perspective of a growth mindset, incredibly powerful. Now, based on your reaction, you kind of seem like you rock with the growth mindset idea as well. So what is your perspective of why that's so important?
So, I mean, it's something that we can all own, right? The more opportunities that we take as leaders to be able to show the people that are working with us that we can own things together, the more cohesive unit that we can be able to create. So part of that is growth, right? So as you're developing and I'm helping you along your way and on your career path, I'm also doing the same thing. So I should not be the same leader this year as I was last year or the year prior to that as well. And then the second part of that is also giving people their roses when they are the ones that have helped to open your eyes to one of those things that you may have not done well. Right, that's something that I had to grow with earlier on in my leadership that I got later on in my leadership was, you know what, I had to thank you and hug you for that feedback that you gave me. That was the thing that pushed me to be able to do something differently. Right, we don't tend to do that, and then we miss that opportunity to create that connectivity once again. because we don't have those things that we share. So we should feel like that growth is something that we all own. One of my favorite authors that's out there from a leadership standpoint is Liz Wiseman, and she had her book Multipliers. I mean that was like a life changing book for me. Like, when I read that, and we talked about whether you can be someone that is a multiplier, which means that you help to add to people, or you could also, as a leader, be a diminisher. Right. So even though your intent may be that I'm going to do everything that I can to help this person to grow, sometimes we can diminish them because we are so protective of ourselves and what we want to own, so on and so forth, that we that we don't allow people to grow, and then we actually take away from their opportunity to be able to be better than they are. So at that point, when I read that, I was like, okay, my mission is going to be that I'm going to find ways to be a multiplier. How do we do that? Is that we both have to own growth. It has to happen on both ends. It cannot be a one-way street.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a tremendous power in that. And I love, that we are on the same page when it comes to that growth mindset and putting yourself in a position to be able to grow, which means being able to take a transparent feedback from the people who you engage with, who you work with, who you collaborate with on how you can improve. But man, I got to tell you, that is some scary stuff, putting yourself in that situation to be able to ask, how can I improve, especially as a leader? You know what I mean? Like that takes some real balls. You got to be able to kind of lean into that.
It does in some ways, and then in some ways it doesn't. I think it's just we have to again adjust the mindset when it comes to it, right? One of the things that we're passionate about is performance management, right? And the reason that people are so, like, I always ask people, think about that first time that you're going to get your employee review, and what did you feel? And most people are like, I was scared to death, I was sweating, I didn't know. I was like, well, why was that? And they're like, well, it's because I didn't really know how I was going to be viewed. Now, these are some people that are A plus performers, and nobody was better than them, and they are concerned about what's going to happen in an evaluation. Why? Because there was no management there, right? It's performance management for a reason. We've managed it throughout the year. We're constantly talking and getting feedback and finding out how we're performing, so on and so forth, right? So when we're doing that, that takes the sting away from feeling like that there's just one conversation that you're going to have where somebody's going to undress you basically and tell you, what you do horribly. And that applies to leadership as well. When we are doing performance management properly, that is a 360 situation. We are not just talking about how well you've performed, but we also have to deal with and uncover, am I doing everything that I should be doing as a leader to prepare you for success? So if you are, underperforming, but we uncover that I did something or overlooked something that kept you from being the best you, then that's my opportunity to say, I need to hear that. That makes sense. And let's set a plan together to make sure that I don't do that to you and that you can succeed going forward. And when that happens, it takes that sting away from having to be called to the carpet, because that's something that you're doing all year long, right? It's not one conversation. It's something that we are doing together. So that creates that growth mindset. We're just growing together. And then I can be able to get that tough conversation, put myself out there. Hey, what do you think about how I led? Right. And then, for instance, one of the things I love to ask now, before I got into the consultant side, one of the things I love to ask was, how do you like to be led? And people don't ever ask that question. I'm like, no, you have to ask them sometimes. That doesn't diminish your ability to be a leader. That's the curiosity piece as well. And that's finding out, how do you like to be led? If you can get that question answered off the bat, man, you know how much better it's going to be from how you lead and then how they are being led. Oh my gosh. One simple question, right? But that's intent. We have to use those intentional things, and that takes the sting away from being held accountable. It takes the sting away from being a leader and being put, up front and saying that, hey, there's some things that I can do better, because we're doing it together.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. When I want to kind of switch gears here and kind of talk about hustle a little bit, the game has changed in how we hustle, right? And specifically, I want to drive this conversation towards technology. Now, since November 2022, we've seen technology completely morph and change right in front of us. One of the biggest things that I pay attention to is AI. And earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned, organizations are looking at how they can use technology to be as lean as possible, but still get a lot of stuff done. So what is your perspective when it comes to technology like ChatGPT, the AI that people can now utilize to kind of supercharge themselves when it comes to productivity? And then kind of how are you seeing it integrate into business in general? What is your 2 cents on AI, and how are we going to be able to use it in the future?
Okay, so for me personally, I'm divided comes to it, right?
Hmm.
Because here's why. Because obviously my business side and my HR side can understand why and how AI can be a huge, huge component of productivity, of being able to get to the point to where we can be the best that we can be with less time, which means that it gives people their lives back, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of positives that comes from that. However, the other side of me is a creative. That's who I am, right? So I went to school for graphic design, and that's I'm an artist, and I have all of that as well in my background. So part of me is scared to death as well of how is this going to affect the creatives out there, whether it's in writing. I love writing, I love designing, I love illustration, so on and so forth. All those things that I love, now something's being generated with an AI to do all of those things. So but what I had to do was get past the initial fear, right?
Hmm.
Because that was real. I had that point, when it first started to come out, I was like, okay, yeah, all the creators are screwed. But then what you learn is that no, we have to learn how to use this creation as a tool, right? Because
Yes.
at the end of the day, it can only do what you feed it, right? So ChatGPT can only be as effective as the creativity in you in telling it what to be able to produce, right? So really the only thing that it just becomes a tool to be able to help you to work faster, right? So if we think about, yeah, in past times, centuries ago, they were making amazing architecture, right? And they were doing it with their hands, you know, hitting that stone and doing everything that they can. Some things that we can't even explain to this day. How did they make those pyramids? That's impossible to have that kind of precision, so on and
Yeah.
so forth, right? But now, when you fast forward to today and the things that we're building and how that they're being built, the same ingenuity is there, the same architectural knowledge is there, but we just have tools that make that a lot easier to be able to do quicker and faster. And in some ways, more efficient, and then being able to protect us better when it comes to what can happen, in our natural world. So that's how I view AI. At the end of the day, it's something that we have to appreciate and something that we need to get out in front of when it comes to being a business to say, how can we leverage that? How can we use that to make sure that we can be as productive as we can be, that we can use this to be able to adjust our labor force and be a little bit more strategic as opposed to just throwing people at it. So as much as I want a ton of people to get jobs, I do want businesses to be a little bit more strategic in how they're actually setting up their productivity logistics, right? You want to be able to get to the point to where you don't just throw another body at it. We need to find better ways to be able to do that with less, because that's what we've all been asked to do, right? If you've ever been in leadership, the one thing you're asked to do is do more with less.
That's
That's
right.
that thing. That's that thing, right? So use the tool, right? So I had to get past the creative side of it, get past the fear of it, and say, how can I use this, and then feel comfort in my creativity, my humanity, my thought processes are something that an AI can never do. Right, so how can I leverage that? So use it. So get on the front of it. Get to the point to where you're the best in the game at using that AI to be able to produce what you needed to produce, and then you'll be just fine, right? So it doesn't take away the creativity. It's just a different tool. It's whether you're using a pencil or a paintbrush.
That's right. That's a great point. And that's the same way that I look at it with my team. Early in our 2023 strategy session, I challenged everybody to be curious because we talked about curiosity a little bit earlier. How can we utilize this tool to be more productive and quicker? I'm sure that when, the ballpoint pen manufacturers from back in the day saw computers and the WordPress and everything else that started coming out there, like, dude, this is it. This is done for us. But us as humans have a continuous way to innovate and execute on the tasks that we have utilizing the technology that's at our fingertips. So I'm very much like you. I believe that ChatGPT and all these tools are amazing because of what they are and their execution, right? The execution has become the commodity now, but the creativeness, your unique touch, your perspective, your ability to communicate emotion and ideas will never be able to be regenerated through AI, in my opinion. And so I have that sense of curiosity that I think we can lean into that is going to become a part of all of us as we kind of supercharge ourselves with the technology like Apple Watches and iPhones and everything else. This is just the next chapter of how technology is going to be integrated into our lives. You know what I mean?
No, you're spot on. I mean, what I joke about now, what I tell people is that think of yourself as Iron Man, right? So every year, Iron Man has a different suit, right?
Mm-hmm.
He adds more and more technology to the suit, but at the end of the day, it's still him that has to be able to to fly that suit and to be able to use that suit. So you can add everything to it, and you need these things to be able to protect yourself against what the world may have, coming against you going forward. But Tony Stark is still Tony Stark, right?
Yep.
So when comic heads know what that means, right? I mean, he is the mind behind that, and he had to create all those things that were needed from a technology standpoint. There's always going to be us behind the scenes. There's always going to be us driving it, right? So why not use that? Why not become the best Iron Man that you can be? Strengthen your arc, reactor, make sure that's good in your chest and that you're strong, and then just use the technology as best you can, so you can be a superhero without having to come naturally because you just use the technology that makes you that way. So that's just my inner Iron Man. That's how I see it.
Man, be the best Iron Man that you can be. I think that's a great place for us to be able to end today, Brian. It's been a pleasure kind of getting your feedback on why we need to be people-centric, how leaders today can start positioning themselves and nurturing the culture that we know is going to be important to attract the truest assets in the future. It's not ChatGPT, but we do need the people to come back into our organizations, and leaning into that's incredibly important. I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. Brian, thank you so much, my friend. It's been an absolute pleasure with you today. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a joy. Thank you for having me. I'm just super pumped that you chose me to be the first one on the reboot here. So I'm just excited to be here for you. And you know that I support everything that you do and the reason that you do it. So it was a no-brainer for me to be a part of it.
Really appreciate you, man. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in today. We got more awesome conversations to come. But Brian, thanks for kicking us off, man. Really appreciate it. Love you guys. Take it easy.